Hello, everyone. To our old friends, welcome back. To our new friends, welcome. Welcome to the webinar on COVID 19 and the impact on small businesses from relief to recovery. My name is Linda Williams. I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action. And on behalf of the entire staff at Consumer Action, welcome. I am so excited about the conversation we are about to have today on small businesses from relief to recovery. And we are honored to have with us today a great panel of experts to discuss the topic with you today. Joining us today is Dr. Janelle Williams. She's a senior advisor with the Community and Economic Development Team with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and Mary Hirt, a research analyst who is also a member of the Community and Economic Development Team of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Also with us today is the founder of Public Private Strategies, a senior fellow with Aspen Institute, Rhett Buttle. We have a great training in store for you, so break out your notepads, your pens, and buckle up because we are bringing the fire today. Now, before I get too excited, I need to go over a few housekeeping items with you. As the announcer stated, you are in listen only mode, but you can use the question function on the right of your screen to type in your questions. We love hearing from you. So at the end of the presentation, Outreach Trainer Nelson Santiago will facilitate a question and answer segment. This is where we get to hear from you, so please take a minute, find that function so you can send Nelson a ton of questions. The webinar is a 90-minute webinar, and yes, it is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording as well as all of the PowerPoint slides used today with a few handouts no later than tomorrow afternoon. AFC professionals, the code word to claim your 1.5 CEUs will also be included in that information. Now, at the end of the training, you will receive your survey about today's webinar. We value your feedback as we work diligently to improve our service to you. So if you have a comment, a suggestion, or even a compliment, we would love to hear from you. So please complete the survey. And as a bonus for attending today, you will receive a certificate of completion. Now, before I go any further, I need to take a moment to thank our sponsor and to update you on what's happening at Consumer Action. This webinar is presented as part of Consumer Action's COVID-19 educational project with funding by Chase. We are very thankful to Chase for the opportunity to reach so many of you, some as far away as Hawaii. So, aloha. So, what do we do at Consumer Action? Where, as it states there on the screen, through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness for all consumers, but especially for underrepresented, marginalized communities nationwide. At Consumer Action, we are proud of all of our work, but we are especially proud of our COVID-19 educational project. So when you're on our website, you click on that little middle burgundy looking link in the middle, and you will land on our COVID-19 project page. There you will find a ton of resources that you can share with your client communities that will help them navigate the COVID 19 financial crisis. Click on the words webinar, and you will land on our YouTube channel where you can review some of our past and very successful webinars. Click on the words fact sheets, and you will find a variety of topics that you can share with your clients. You can download them or you can send your clients to our website. We have fact sheets on identity theft and account fraud during COVID 19, fair housing rights, estate planning, financial help for undocumented workers, just to name a few. Check it out. Go to www.consumer-org/COVID-19 and just check out the resources available for you free of charge. Now, let me review the agenda with you quickly so you'll know where we're headed today. At Consumer Action, we believe in making learning fun. So we open up each and every training, regardless to whether it's virtual or in person, by testing your knowledge on the training topic with our most popular game, How Much Do You Know? So today we have three true or false questions related to COVID-19's impact on small businesses. Following the game, I will introduce you to our guest professionals in the order that they will be presenting. A question and answer segment led by Nelson Santiago will follow. I will come back tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action and wrap up. So Let the game begin. Let's get started with the game. So, this is how the game is played. We have three questions. All are true or false. I will read each question, and you will use the poll function to answer each question. Once the poll is closed, we will take a look at the results. I will tell you if the statement is true or false and why. At the end of the game, the person with the most correct answers will he or she walk away with the bragging rights to say it with me. How much do you know? So, are you ready? Okay, let's roll out that first question. The number of active business owners in the U.S. plummeted by 22% over a 2 month period from February to April 2020. Now, is that true or is that false? The number of active business owners in the United States plummeted by 22% over a 2 month period from February to April 2020. Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Wow, 81% thinks it's true, 19% says it's false. Well, 81%, you are correct. As reported in the 2020 Small Businesses of Color Recovery Guide, the decrease in business ownership was the largest on record, and losses were felt across nearly all industries and even for incorporated companies. African American businesses were hit especially hard, experiencing a 41% drop. Latinx business owners fell by 32%, and Asian business ownership dropped by 26%. Dr. Janelle Williams is one of the authors of the Small Businesses of Color Recovery Guide, and we'll discuss a few takeaways from the guide today. A copy of the report will also be included in the documents that you receive tomorrow. You're doing great. Let's move on to the next question. Before COVID 19, single men were the fastest growing segment of small business owners in the United States. Is that true or is that false? Before COVID 19, single men were the fastest growing segment of small business owners in the United States. Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Wow, 30% think it's true. 70% you think that's false? With 70%, you are correct. It is false. According to an October 2021 article in Forbes, written by one of our guest speakers, Rhett Buttle, and the title of the article is Advocating for Women Entrepreneurs, a conversation with women impacting public policy, President and CEO Candace Waterman. Before COVID 19, women were the fastest growing segment of small business owners. And the fastest growing segment of businesses were owned by Black women. It's a great article, and a copy will be included in the documents you receive tomorrow. You're doing good. We have one more. One more question. Come on, let's roll out the next question. Okay, true or false? After the onset of COVID 19, 80% of small businesses reported that pandemic related business challenges impacted their personal finance. Is that true or false? After the onset of COVID 19, 80% of small businesses reported that pandemic related business challenges impacted their finances. Is that true or false? Wow. Let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Oh my goodness. 100% of you think that's true? Actually, 100% of you think that's true? You're right. It's true. It's true. According to the Federal Reserve Bank 2021 Small Business Credit Survey, Dr. Williams and Ms. Hirt both contributed to that survey, and I believe Ms. Hirt will provide us with some highlights of that report. I'll just share with you a couple. 51% of owners paid business expenses with their personal funds. 63% of owners didn't draw a salary or they drew a reduced salary. Again, this report will be in the documents that you will receive tomorrow. You guys are awesome. Thank you for playing the game. Now you ready to be amazed. Let me introduce you to our first guest speaker. Brett Buttle is an entrepreneur, an advocate, and one of the most trusted leaders at the intersection of business and policy in Washington, D.C. Most recently, he served as a national business advisor to President Joe Biden's 2020 campaign. He has worked for President Barack Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He is the founder of Public Private Strategies and the president of the Public Private Strategies Institute, which works to bring together public and private sector to build coalition, activate campaigns, and create strategic partnerships to drive policy and market outcomes. In these roles, he advises leading policymakers, foundations, nonprofits, and corporations. In addition, he has helped found the Small Business Roundtable, Small Business for American Future, and Next Gen Chamber of Commerce. He is also a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute and regularly contributes to Forbes, where he writes on the intersection of business, policy, and politics. He has been featured in the New York Times, on CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and several other business publications, and now on Consumer Actions YouTube. Welcome. Our next speaker will be Dr. Janelle Williams. Dr. Williams serves as a senior advisor on the Atlanta's Federal Community and Economic Development Team. In this role, Dr. Williams cultivates and expands partnerships to foster cross-sectional collaborations to promote economic mobility across the 6 districts. Prior to joining Atlanta Fed, she led economic opportunity initiatives for the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Atlantic Civic Site. Dr. Williams has extensive research experience in an array of socioeconomic and international issues. Previously, she led efforts to incorporate data analysis and evaluations into program design and implementations at the Center for Working Families, Inc. She served as a congressional fellow in the U.S. House of Representatives, conducting policy research on issues tied to education, health, workforce development, and immigration. She received her doctorate in international family and community studies from Clemson University, a master's degree in public administration from the University of Georgia, and a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology from Florida Memorial University. And we are honored to have her with us today. We're also honored to have with us today Mary Hirt. She is a research analyst for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's Community and Economic Development Team. She supports the team through research, data analysis, communications, and outreach efforts. Ms. Hurst holds a Bachelor's of Arts in International Studies with minors in Social Work and Urban Studies from the University of Michigan. After moving to Atlanta, she earned her master's degree in City and Regional Planning from Georgia's Institute of Technology, where she specialized in housing and community development, with research focusing on housing mobility, community policing, and racial wealth inequalities. Before pursuing her graduate degree, she worked for the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research in Ann Arbor and the Center for Civic Innovation in Atlanta. Welcome, Mary. Special welcome to all of our guest speakers. Now, let's get to it. Let me turn this presentation over to our first guest speaker, Mr. Buttle. Give me 1 second. If I can find, there it is. I will turn the presentation over to you. Okay, you have control.
We do. Thank you so much. And thank you, Linda and Santiago, for all the amazing work you all do. We're so proud to be here today and excited to partner on this webinar and many more things. And also want to give a big shout out to my friends and colleagues at the Atlanta Fed who do amazing work supporting entrepreneurs. You heard a little bit about public-private strategies. One of the things that we do at PPS, which is public-private strategies for short, is we run a number of initiatives. And so when COVID-19 started to break out, we really begin to hear from entrepreneurs, particularly in communities of color, about the impact that COVID-19 was having on them. So we hosted a meeting. A lot of folks showed up. We had folks from chambers of commerce around the country, business leaders, policymakers, philanthropic partners, both in the corporate sector, as well as NGOs join us and say, we all need to come together to do something to help make sure entrepreneurs survive COVID-19. And through that process was born Reimagine Main Street, which is our project here that is focused not only on small business owners, but also the people who work for them. And part of that is because we know and we understand the important role that entrepreneurs play in society. Not only are they our job creators, not only do they create huge opportunities for advancement in their communities, but they're seen as community leaders. They're pillars of their community. And so we know that this would be a huge part of making sure that we recovered and that we not only built back from the pandemic, but that we use this as an opportunity to build back better. And so one of the ways that we've been doing some of that work is we have been doing a lot of polling. And so we have been really pleased to partner in particular with 3 of the national chambers of commerce. So the US Black Chambers Inc., which is the National Black Chamber, the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and National ACE, which is the National Asian Chamber of Commerce and Entrepreneurship. And we've been partnering with a number of partners from across the spectrum, state, local groups. But these 3 partners have been key anchor partners in really helping us to understand, go out into the field to understand what's going on with small business owners. And we were able to field what we believe is, but may not be, but we believe is the largest survey of business owners of color. And what we heard from the field, I think, was both inspiring, but also allowed us to really sort of understand that there's more work to do. So even despite everything small business owners have been through, these are some of the most optimistic people that you will ever meet, particularly as vaccines started to come into the market. We heard levels of confidence begin to rise. We saw more sort of optimism come into the economy. But the reality is that too many business owners, particularly business owners in Black, Brown, and AAPI communities, just felt like the government resources that were available to many business owners weren't reaching them. And you can see some of the stats here, both about confidence, but both about some of the challenges and business owners really feeling sort of backstopped by the relief efforts, which, as you can imagine, was not part of the goal. As I talked about, you'll see optimism was high amongst all communities here. We've tried to break down the respondents by AAPI, Black, Hispanic, Latinx, as well as Native. And so for the ability to sort of compare and contrast and for people to see how different communities are feeling about sort of the status of the economy. In particular, we saw that Hispanic and Latino men were more optimistic than their counterparts. And generally, what we have found is even coming, out of the pandemic, business owners were generally confident about the trajectory of the economy. And we found that in particular, Black owners were most confident about the direction of the economy and where it's been headed. Now, that doesn't mean that they felt like things were coming out of the woods or that they were necessarily experiencing recovery equally, but we did see signs of confidence, which we thought was good. One of the things I think is really important, and we saw some of this in our early research, and it's really continued to sort of bear out over time, is that across the board, women business owners are less likely than men to really understand that business is returning to normal. We also saw that older entrepreneurs felt as though they were experiencing slower recovery than their other peers. And that's an important signal because we know that the vast majority of people who start businesses in our country are in the 50+ age range. Older entrepreneurs are a very important demographic. And so we want them to be able to feel good about economy, feel good about their recovery, and feel like they have the supports that they needed in place. And as I mentioned before, a lot of business owners, while they were optimistic, they really felt as though the recovery, primarily that was being handed down by the federal government in terms of the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP for short, or the COVID EIDL program, while they were being helpful, they just felt as though it wasn't being experienced equally. Here we've broken down some of the research by gender so that you can get a sense of how, in particular, women were feeling about recovery. You can see here that women generally were expecting a slower recovery than their male peers, and I think really anticipated that the pandemic would have a longer life. And I think some of that is borne out, as we've all seen to be true. As well, as I talked about before, we see that business owners in the 50+ category, which are the vast majority of business owners, also were feeling similar. They expected at least 6 months or even longer before they might get back to pre-pandemic revenue. So that was kind of a reflection and sort of looking back. And I think, one of the pieces that we wanted to understand as we were doing more research, and I think you'll hear about some of this from my colleagues at the Fed who are way smarter than I, but is that small business owners were really focused on addressing demand for relatively small dollar loans. What we often hear from small businesses is access to capital is key. A lot of times they're not looking for huge amounts of dollars. And you'll see here that, a lot of small employers were, confident that they were going to be able to bring in talent to grow their businesses, but they were still feeling like access to capital was a huge issue for them to be able to grow their business. You'll see here in particular, as we break it down by race and ethnicity, that there was low confidence in the ability to access to capital, which we know that this can just be such a critical catalyst. We looked at the way we phrase this question, or we looked at it, with folks, respondents with 2020 revenue of up to 250,000. And then you'll see here we broke it down by different race and ethnicity to sort of get an understanding of what's going on. And I think what we see is, as business owners sort of get larger, for larger businesses, race and ethnicity inform sort of the confidence or their ability to access capital. And you can see this here in the difference between business owners of color and their white peers, and how they feel about their ability to be able to access to capital, which is key. So what are some of the key sort of takeaways from sort of, piecing this and all of this research? I'm just presenting sort of a small snippet today. Is available on our website, reimaginemainstreet.org. In general, we saw that, small businesses were feeling pretty good when vaccines came online. We saw that, confidence, people are feeling good about the economy. But again, they were feeling like not necessarily that it was time to sort of, celebrate, and that they weren't out of the woods. But in particular, they felt like the relief programs that were structured, while helpful, were not shared equally. In particular, business owners of color felt like that there were some real systematic gaps, particularly around bias and barriers in terms of being able to access capital, which we know is increasingly critical. I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the forward path as we sort of have come into this new moment, because I think there's been a lot of conversation about the pandemic and post-pandemic. Obviously, we're in a moment now where people are talking a lot about inflation. What does that mean for business owners? As we continue to come out of the pandemic, we see real headwinds and challenges with supply chain issues with some small businesses where supply chains are important. But I think we also see signs of optimism. And I think, one big piece of that has been the bipartisan infrastructure deal. So as many of you know, President Biden signed in one of the most, in my opinion, transformational pieces of legislation that many of us will see in our lifetimes. It's the largest investment in infrastructure, both hard and what I would say is soft infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But this deal includes $550 billion in new federal investments. And I think most of us think of things like roads and bridges, which are really important, but this also is a huge investment in things that really enable entrepreneurship. Think about broadband infrastructure and the ability for every American to have more access to high-speed internet. One of the big pieces we saw during the pandemic was small business owners really moving to take advantage of digital tools. A lot of businesses who had never been online before, who had never maybe used social media or other digital tools to be able to communicate with their customer base, or even expand their current base, were kind of put in a position to do so, right, during the pandemic. And so we saw increased uptake, but that means that we need the services to be able to do so. And so we think the investment in broadband infrastructure is something that is important for consumers, for workers, for working families, but we also think it enables entrepreneurship. Obviously, the investments in things that we don't, often think about when we're starting a business, like upgrading our power infrastructure, modernizing our public transit. I think a lot of folks do think about roads and bridges, but we don't think about things like sewer lines, but also important things like clean drinking water and infrastructure to be able to do those things. So all of these large investments, we really think present not only critical infrastructure pieces that we need to be able to enable business, but we also think they present contracting opportunities. And we're in a moment now where right now the federal government is thinking about, has begun to move some of this money out the door. A lot of that money will flow down into state and local governments, and there will be opportunities in that flow for small business owners to take advantage of it. And then lastly, before I wrap up and turn things over to my colleagues, I did want to talk a little bit about the Build Back Better initiative. As some of you may know, this is different than the bipartisan infrastructure deal. The bipartisan infrastructure deal has already passed. This is really, for me, the third leg of the stool, which is, coming out of the pandemic, I think business owners and working families and entrepreneurs are thinking about work differently. It made a lot of us think about, how do we want to structure our lives? How do we want to have a relationship with our employees? And I think what we found is that for too many entrepreneurs and working families, life is still a little too hard. And I think that there are ways that the federal government and state governments can help support some of that. As we know, President Biden and many members of Congress have put forth the Build Back Better plan, which is still being debated in Congress, or parts of it are being debated. And there's some pieces of it, that are important. So while these pieces have not passed yet, I think these are continued goals that we all might want to be looking forward to for things that help working families and small businesses. And we know that small businesses play a critical role in terms of hiring workers, and their success really leads to working family success. So some big pieces are the child care tax credit and the earned income tax credit. Both of these did have extensions recently under the American Rescue Plan and have been helping working families. And for folks who haven't looked into these as potential options, I encourage you to do so. However, extension of these does end, and I think there's a continued effort to push to get them further extended in some of the efforts that we're seeing in Congress. The second is, in all of our survey research, just behind access to capital and sometimes higher, we often hear about how healthcare cost is impacting small businesses and entrepreneurs. And we think some of the plans that have been laid out in the Build Back Better plan to close the Medicaid gap, as well as to potentially expand Medicare, could be really helpful to lowering costs, not only for the system, but also for individual folks. And a lot of folks who have a great idea or want to start a business are often held back because they can't access affordable healthcare. And we want to make sure that getting, life-saving healthcare that people need is not the barrier to them, if they have a great idea that could grow into a business. The second is just general investments in small business. So the package does provide quite a bit of funds to invest in, for example, the U.S. Small Business Administration, the Minority Business Development Agency at the federal level, all of which are critical agencies. The fourth is childcare, which I think has, in my opinion, is starting to get more attention, which is so important. We know what a critical role women in particular play in our society and play in terms of starting small businesses. They're some of the fastest growing communities. In particular, we see a lot of optimism among Black women, but we know childcare is an issue both for men and women, and this is something we really need to figure out how to tackle, not only for working families, but to promote entrepreneurship. And so we think a number of the investments in childcare. And then lastly, paid family medical leave. And there's been some progress made in some states to make sure that everyone has access to paid family medical leave. But we think this is also a barrier that Congress needs to address more nationally that we think will help working families and spur more entrepreneurship. So with that, I just want to thank you all so much for your time. I want to let folks know you can visit our website, which is www.reimaginemainstreet.org, or you can check out our website, publicprivatestrategies.com. And with that, it is my pleasure to pause there and Linda, turn the conversation back to you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Williams and Ms. Hirt. You both have control.
Wonderful. We're really excited to be part of today's conversation and really want to thank Consumer Action for inviting us to participate in today's discussion, and certainly be joined by Rep with Public-Private Ventures. We really admire the work that they do and really look forward to getting questions and fostering a really innovative and meaningful exchange as we think about strategies to support small businesses. It's really important that we share that the views that we're going to express today are not our own, and they are our own, and they do not necessarily reflect the positions of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the system. We support the community economic development function of our nation's central banks. And as we all know, the bank's mandate is to really support stable prices and maximize employment. Within this dual mandate, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta is also advancing one strategic priority among several others to foster economic mobility and resilience. And for us, this includes thoughtfully examining barriers to economic inclusion and exploring innovative and evidence based models that help everyone join the economic mainstream so that we could support a really thriving economy. The work in our community economic development team is really organized around two core functional pillars, which include research and engagement. We usually focus on four core topical areas, and they're really broad: community development finance, economic development, housing and neighborhoods, and workforce. You will see small business is not considered a discrete topical area because it actually intersects with many of these core pillars. Both Mary and I sit on the engagement team, and we're pleased to share some of the work we've been doing these past 18 months with several of our colleagues in the system and partners across the district and nationally to really think about ways to foster an inclusive and resilient recovery for small businesses. I'm going to transition to Mary as she walks us through our small business credit survey.
Thank you, Janelle. So hello, everyone. As Janelle mentioned, my name is Mary Hirt, and I am an engagement analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta in our Community and Economic Development Group. I'd first like to thank Linda and Consumer Action for having us here this morning to discuss small business and the Federal Reserve Small Business Credit Survey. Linda thought it also might be good or helpful to briefly cover what a small business is and their importance. So these graphics are from the U.S. Small Business Administration's Office of Advocacy, which defines small business as independent firms with fewer than 500 employees. Small businesses play a huge role in the American economy, as my colleagues have already discussed on today's call. In fall of 2021, there were 32.5 million small businesses in the US, making up 99% of all firms within our country, and employing 46.8%, or nearly half of all private sector workers within our country. Small firms create economic opportunity in local communities and help drive innovation in the macro economy. Given this national significance, timely information on small business economic conditions, financing needs, and credit availability is increasingly important. And so with that in mind, today I'd like to present on the Federal Reserve System's efforts around small business, namely the Small Business Credit Survey. So the Small Business Credit Survey, or SBCS as I'll refer to it, is an annual survey of small businesses run by a collaboration between all 12 Federal Reserve banks. The survey's goal is to collect small business perspectives to provide information on the state of small businesses' financing needs, performance, and experiences to policymakers, financial institutions, and other stakeholders. The 2021 survey was administered in September through November. A total of approximately 18,000 businesses responded to the online survey, with 11,000 of those being employer firms or businesses with employees, and 7,000 being non-employer firms or sole proprietor. The survey is a convenient sample of small businesses reached through a network of community partners, and the responses are weighted to create a nationally representative picture of businesses and credit conditions. So the Small Business Credit Survey is a valuable source of small firm data across owner and business characteristics, as seen on this slide. that would otherwise be rather hard to come by. So this demographic data is instrumental in developing a deep understanding of small business space, understanding the small business space, and allows us to identify particular businesses or industries which may need the most attention from policymakers, lenders, and other leaders in their community. So here you can see that the SBCS breaks down by owner characteristics such as race, ethnicity, gender, credit risk, and business characteristics such as revenue size, industry, size of firm, age of firm, etc. Before digging into the data, I wanted to provide an overview of demographics of US small businesses that responded in our 2021 Small Business Credit Survey. So out of our respondents in fall of 2021, some of the key demographics can be seen listed on the slide, including 55% were firms with fewer than 5 employees, a third are firms younger than 5 years of age, 17% were owned by people of color, 21% owned by women, and 2/3 had self-reported low credit risk. Key findings of the 2022 report on employer firms include that the pandemic continues to have significant impact on small businesses, with 59%, a majority of firms, in poor financial condition. The percent of firms receiving financial pandemic-related assistance was also down from 2020. To level set, let's look at our national sample of employer firms and see how their performance has changed over time. Here we're looking at the share of businesses that said their revenues either increased, decreased, or remained unchanged in the 12 months leading up to the survey period. From 2016 to 2019 surveys, we saw little movement. In fact, small business performance appeared to be getting slightly stronger over time. However, in our 2020 survey, which was fielded approximately 6 months after the start of the pandemic, we found that 3/4 of firms experienced a decline in revenues, as marked in orange. This was a massive but not too surprising change given all of the challenges that small businesses faced right after the start of the pandemic. We found that revenue performance improved slightly in 2021 in the fall, with only 48% responding that revenues had declined the prior year. That number would look concerning when stacked up against our pre-pandemic surveys, but provides some optimism given the increase from our 2020 findings. So those year-over-year findings are helpful in assessing how small businesses are trending, but we also wanted to understand how far along businesses are in their recovery from the pandemic. So last year, we asked businesses whether their revenues had decreased, stayed the same, or increased, specifically since the same time in 2019. Close to 2/3 of all small employer firms told us that their revenues remained lower, and only a quarter saying their revenues had actually risen since 2019. So here we see that many firms have yet to fully recover the revenues lost from the pandemic. On the second figure at the bottom of the screen, we see the share of firms that reported a revenue decline since 2019, broken out by race and ethnicity of firm ownership. Here we see that Asian-owned firms were most likely to report that revenues had not yet reached pre-pandemic levels. And we also see that Black and Hispanic-owned businesses lag white-owned firms with respect to recovery in revenues as well. Looking at another breakdown, here we see when we switch to looking at firms reporting declined revenues by firm size, we see that smaller firms with fewer employees are most likely to report revenues had not yet recovered at the time of the survey. The largest difference here is seen between the 1 to 4 employee category and the 50 to 499 firm size, with less than half of the largest firms saying that their revenues were lower than in 2019. And one last demographic cut here. The story of small businesses post-pandemic isn't complete without thinking about industry. And we've all heard stories over the past 2 years about the struggles of many service sector-based businesses. And those anecdotes seem to play out in our 2021 SBCS responses, with businesses in leisure and hospitality, as well as healthcare and education, reporting continued lag in revenues since 2019. Here we get a different look at the story of an unequal recovery that we've been talking about throughout today's presentations. So in the two most recent surveys, we asked respondents to rate the financial condition of their businesses, either poor, fair, okay, or excellent. And in fall 2021, 59% of all businesses said they were in poor or fair financial condition, basically unchanged from the last year's responses. But diving into the demographic data tells us some clearer stories, namely that firms of color, smaller businesses, and leisure and hospitality firms were each more likely to report that their businesses were in poor or fair financial condition at the time of the survey. Beyond the financial conditions of firms, we also explored financial challenges experienced over time and how small businesses respond to those challenges. So between 2019 and 2020, there was a 15% increase in firms reporting experiencing financial challenges in the prior 12 months leading up to the survey, which again increased in fall 2021 survey. Some of the actions most often taken in response to financial challenges include obtaining emergency-related assistance funding, using personal funds, and cash reserves. In terms of firms who sought financial assistance, such as PPP, grants, and other sources of funds that did not have to be repaid, both the share of firms that applied for assistance and the share of firms that received that financial assistance declined between 2020 and 2021. Separate from financial assistance, those funds that don't need to be repaid that we looked at on the previous slide, the staple purpose of the Small Business Credit Survey is to look into the credit and financing needs of small firms. Access to financing is a vital lifeline for small businesses, whether they're looking to expand their operations or navigate challenging financial times, such as the past 2 years. We found that this year, 36% of businesses in our sample applied for some sort of financing in the prior 12 months leading up to the survey. As is consistent finding throughout prior years of our SBCS, firms of color were more likely than white-owned businesses to seek financing. We find that firms of color were more likely to seek financing to meet operating expenses like wages or rent than white-owned respondents. We also found that overall, the percentage of firms applying to meet operating expenses has increased over time. And while we'll keep combing through some key findings on access to financing, the SBCS provides valuable data on those that chose not to pursue financing as well. So as we see here, the reason varied substantially across firms by race and ethnicity of ownership. So here we're looking at firms who did not apply for financing and the reasons they didn't apply by race and ethnicity. Green displays the share of firms that had sufficient financing, while the other bars represent firms that chose not to apply for financing despite needing it. The blue bar represents the share of firms that told us they were debt averse. The yellow bar represents firms that were discouraged. For example, they believed they had weak financials or thought lender requirements were too strict. And the other gray bars include firms that said that the cost of credit was too high, the process was too difficult, or some other reason. So the differences seen between white and Black-owned firms is particularly striking to me. Here we see that half of white-owned firms didn't apply for financing because they didn't need it. Meanwhile, only 13% of Black-owned firms said that they did not apply for financing because they did not need it. In other words, 87% of Black non-applicants said they chose not to apply despite needing financing. So another interesting finding around financing is that across all firms over time, we've seen that financing has been harder to come by since 2019, with the share of firms reporting receiving all of the financing they sought dipping from 51% in 2019 to 30% in the most recent survey. As we see on the next slide, we've also seen the SBCS in the past, financing approvals differ noticeably within demographic categories. So finally, when looking at share of financing received overall by demographics, nearly every type of firm was less likely to report receiving all of the financing they sought in the 2021 survey than in 2019. So here we see drops in access to financing across race, size of the business, and industry. Now let's turn our attention to those dark green bars on the left-hand side, which show the share of firms that said they were fully approved for financing in 2021. Looking at race of ownership, white-owned firms remained far more likely than firms of color to receive all of the financing they applied for. And as we see on this slide, both smaller firms as well as service sector firms, particularly again, those in leisure and hospitality industries, reported challenges accessing financing and were less likely to obtain the financing they needed. So again, recall back to some of those earlier slides where the firms here that reported challenges accessing financing were also those that most often reported that revenues had not yet recovered since 2019 and said financial conditions were particularly rough. Those firms facing the steepest recovery are also those struggling to access this important lifeline, which is access to capital or access to financing, which, as we know and have discussed, is such an important tool for businesses navigating challenging financial times. So with that, that is all I have time for today, but I want to make sure that you are all aware that the results presented today are all available in the Small Business Credit Survey 2022 report on employer firms, as well as the detailed appendix and the survey questionnaire, which are all available on our website, which is fedsmallbusiness.org. You can see previous year's reports, as well as reports on firms owned by people of color, non-employer firms, and forthcoming reports on workforce challenges. With that, I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, Janelle Williams, who will further discuss small businesses in terms of recovery.
Thank you, Mary. And I will just say, please feel free if your organization has not previously participated in SBCS, feel free to reach out to Mary and I, and we would love to engage you. If you do provide at least 50 responses, we are able to offer individual organizational level reports, which many of our partners have shared. It's been very helpful for them. So really intentionally putting in a plug here for you to participate in this survey. So we've heard a lot today about the challenges that small businesses, particularly firms of color, are experiencing as they navigate this COVID-infused economy. As a result, we worked with colleagues in Kansas City, Del Giants is one of them, to really think about what type of resources, recommendations, and strategies would be incredibly helpful for small businesses of color to consider and to make these resources available for them, given the disproportionate impact firms of color are experiencing in this pandemic. One of the things we wanted to lift up was really thinking about the value of building an entrepreneurship ecosystem, particularly as we think about data that was released around the closure of these firms, particularly firms of color, as high as 41% for some Black-owned businesses. The importance of creating an entrepreneurship ecosystem, really allowing to weave the intersection of skills, financing, social capital, culture, infrastructure, and policy recommendations is incredibly important for these firms not only to survive, but for them to be viable and competitive in this market. And to really be clear on understanding these recommendations, it's very important that we decouple this notion of silver bullets, right? Or really thinking that one particular approach is superior to an alternative. We're really clear that one program, one resource, one strategy alone or exclusively administered will not be sufficient to address the disparities we see in revenues, in firm size by revenue, firm size by number of employees, and even industry representation for firms of color, right? And in order to close that gap, we have to think about multi-pronged and multifaceted approaches to support firms of color to not just survive, but again, thrive in this COVID-infused economy. And so our work was really informed by data like the Small Business Credit Survey, but also scores of interviews we conducted with key ecosystem partners across the field. And we synthesized those recommendations across 5 core pockets that really focused on capital and credit, policy, provider recommendations, and this is part of your TA space, education and training, and also community. And I'll spend some time just giving very high level summaries, but again, you should have access to the report, which is publicly available, and we're also willing to offer additional presentations to provide details on these recommendations. So one is around capital and credit. And several of the interviews we conducted, even prior to working on this report, we heard from several investors, particularly those in the philanthropic community, that they really saw it was critical to support low and no cost credit and capital. And several of the CDFIs and other capital providers were interested in exploring like what type of facilities could be structured to support these tools and resources. And one thing we saw coming out of the pandemic, which was a silver lining, as we heard from some of these investors, was they actually saw when they changed their PRI or MRI, program-related investment, market-related investment from a philanthropic standpoint, where they either opted for 0% interest or deferred payments, that they actually saw that the performance of these portfolios were not actually compromised. They were starting to really even perform higher than the traditional loan structure that they initiated. Several CDFIs said they opted to really scale character-based lending programs, and they reported really impressive results where they did not see people actually defaulted on their loans, but people were actually able to really maximize these character-based loan programs, which actually started well ahead of the pandemic, but scaling them were an essential resource for several of these firms of colors and particularly micro businesses. There's also an important need to really think about flexible underwriting. And as we think about these underwriting practices, really interrogating the different checkpoints that are embedded in implicit bias. We all hold biases. And as we think about some of the underwriting practices, questions, and overall decision making, really thoughtfully assessing, are there implicit biases embedded within these underwriting practices? And in identifying those potential biases, how can they be effectively redirected so that we explore more equitable access to capital and credit for all firms, so that we can really salvage the small business ecosystem that is needed? I think it's really important as we think about firms of color in particular to understand at a national level, well over 90% of firms of color are not only micro businesses, meaning there are less than 5 employees, but they're solopreneurs, which is really, there's the only employee is the actual owner, right? And so as we think about these firms of color, many of them serve as the exclusive way for the actual owner slash employee to participate in the economic mainstream. And so as we think about options around access to capital and credit, really also underpinning in the underwriting process, what are the sustaining and scalable options for these firms is incredibly important. We also got a lot of feedback around education and training and really understanding the value of this and what is important. You know, my own personal story, I'm the daughter of an entrepreneur. My former partner is an entrepreneur. We still have our business, which is thriving right now. And, you know, as I recall stories of my dad and his business, which right now, you know, he migrated and the business is no longer vibrant. One of the things that's really clear, and we heard this over and over in the interviews, and it's consistent, you know, entrepreneurs are passionate about the skill that brought to bear and got them into business. That is their gift, that is their talent. Where the challenge lies, as we all know, is in the infrastructure and operations, and really, how do you translate this skill, this gift, this talent to a marketable and profitable business? And so as we think about education and training, it's really around those factors. Really thinking about how does one leverage technology? And we saw this happen in COVID. And we saw, without a concerted effort by local community stakeholders to really invest in their local restaurants and local shops, it was really hard for them to compete with big chain restaurants, for instance, which quickly pivoted and leveraged really massive digital marketing campaigns where one could do online orders. And they were able to still keep their doors open. Businesses that were able to make a quick technological pivot had a significantly higher likelihood of keeping their doors open. And that's important. COVID has challenged us in so many ways. And some of that challenge really does include reinvigorating the way that we consider training and targeted technical assistance so that it is both available and accessible. And as we think about prior ways of engagement for entrepreneurs, it really resorted to very traditional, in-person, regulated check-ins where one could sign up for a class. These are the hours, these are the specific days, and really think about how could we actually translate and leverage technology in the education and training space so that more people could access these resources, and we can do it in a way that's flexible and support the demands of these entrepreneurs. We also offered several recommendations around policy, leading with really diverse government procurement policies. And we thought this was really important at multiple levels, right? Certainly actually local municipalities, statewide, and federal. You know, when you think about cities that are more racially, ethnically diverse, they have wild variation in their MBE participation rates. And cities that still have representative MBE participation, when we consider that MBE participation for state level contracts, we see their participation rates significantly dwarf compared to their counterparts. And again, that's a really important feature to consider, assess, and solve for, because businesses could only thrive and scale if they're able to also compete in larger contracts and expand the scope of their work. And so as we think about procurement policies and practices and what that means at the state level, Fed level, really warrants deep consideration, right? The other use is to really think about how subsidies are thoughtfully leveraged to encourage participation for firms of colors, and what are the ways to consider the use of these subsidies, both in the site selection process, both as we think about economic development projects, how are we negotiating the MDA agreements, and how are we also exploring incorporating economic inclusion targets in some of these exhibits so that we are able to really support and retain the small businesses of color. And many of these firms, as we know, are also very vulnerable to commercial displacement. And then with that, really thinking about how do we improve place-based policies, such as business improvement districts. What does that look like? Certainly, there are several programs that several EDAs have explored, facade improvement grants, commercial acquisition strategies, but how could this be done and adopted in a way that can be sustainable and scalable? Some of the things that we are really exploring is, how can we experiment with using alternative types of physical infrastructure that certainly are assets, but they offer more agility, more mobility for the business owners, right? Some examples that come to mind are containers, and we're seeing containers actually really take up a lot in the Northeast and the West Coast, exploring it in the South as well, but really leveraging like shipping containers and really using those containers around commercial corridors and giving business owners the type of agility and mobility they need so that they can actually leverage an authentic demand. I referenced that we spoke with dozens of individuals for this particular report, scores others on the heels of the onset of the pandemic, and even 15 months into the pandemic. And many cited some of the barriers they continue to see in contracting. And as we think about policy barriers and contracting barriers, are really looking at policy barriers to address contracting barriers. Policy barriers that address contracting is one example of where we think there's a lot of opportunity for us to leverage and explore further. We also wanted to lift up work that was happening across several communities across the country. And we really saw buy local campaigns resuscitate in a really dynamic and nuanced way. Buy local was important. There were several like support local campaigns, which really helped to re-energize focus and enthusiasm around these businesses. There's also a lot of opportunity to think about ways to, when we say improve the local environment, it's also to think about really industry scans. And as we think about these larger chains that are in our cities or rural areas or smaller mid-sized places, really thinking about like how are we thoughtfully assessing what's the representation of local businesses. Would these smaller businesses be as viable, as marketable? Will they have the marketing and the infrastructure to fulfill purchase orders or compete with larger firms? And so really being intentional around that. I will spend some time just offering some high-level thoughts. Mary started around industry representation and industry matters, and we continue to see firms of color are really overrepresented in what would consider these vulnerable industries. And when we consider vulnerable industries for us, we borrow methodology from Philadelphia Fed, where we look at proximity to coworkers and customers, where at least 40% of these coworkers customers are in close proximity to each other. And so those industries include accommodation and food services, retail trade, transportation, arts and entertainment. And we see firms of colors really clustered in these industries. So one thing as we think about these scans and even policy recommendations is how do we really work to mitigate barriers to entry in high growth industries so that we can really support firms of color to think about not just small businesses as an income play, but a wealth building strategy. And then as we think about providers / investors in this space as well, is really thinking about how do we prioritize locally owned programs, and how do we also prioritize leveraging local expertise and talent to create and foster a relevant ecosystem that is accessible, that is meaningful, and really taps into the creative space of this entrepreneurship ecosystem. We also want to be intentional to support providers as they explore how do we really brave these funding mechanisms. And on the heels of COVID, we saw that there were different types of conversations around what is a rule, what is a requirement, and what's a result. And those questions did not always land on the same responses, and really encourage people to tilt conventional wisdom on its head, actually, and think about how can we be more entrepreneurial in serving entrepreneurs. Not really mind-blowing, but really thinking about how could we work around the dots and not just connect the dots, so that we could offer resources to people in a real-time way so that they could keep their businesses open. And for the businesses that can't retain their doors or keep their doors open, what are the opportunities to consider strategic partnerships, right? And what are the opportunities in the M&A space for shared ownership? What does that look like? And where's the space for those models in the underwriting process that we currently have? So as we think about this work, this work lands on the premise of strategic doing framework, which is largely fueled by the Kaufman Foundation. And as Mary and I are thinking about, we have all this data and research, we're also really mindful around making sure that theory and practice is bridged, and really exploring what does activation looks like. So certainly, how is our work informed by what we're hearing from our partners? And also, how do we make sure that we make our resources, tools, learning accessible to broader communities? And so we're really exploring ways to engage in different places, and really strengthening their entrepreneurship ecosystem. And we have several resources we wanted to share. Hopefully you will get a copy of this deck, which gives you direct links to this work. And as we think about entrepreneurship, there are several pillars around it, right? It's like people and place for profit. And so we've done a lot around the people side, and we've certainly done a lot around communities / place, and have some corresponding resources for you to consider as you think about your respective work. Again, my email is listed, as well as Mary's. We're really excited to hear your questions, delve into a meaningful discussion and exchange. But thank you again for having us, and we hope that this presentation was helpful for your work.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you to all of our members of our great panel. Let me turn this over to Nelson to see if there are any questions from my audience.
Yes, Linda, thank you to the speakers for that. We do have people thanking the speakers for the great presentations, so wanted to pass that along. And then in terms of some of the questions here, somebody is asking if you could talk a little bit more really about access to credit and lending. This last speaker mentioned fair access to credit and lending. They're asking, do you mean fair access, or do you mean equitable access? Is there a difference there? What more can you tell us?
Yeah, so I invite several of the speakers to tag team with me on this, but even the findings, and these are consistent from what Mary shared in our both our 2020 and 2021 Small Business Credit Survey report, we saw that controlling for revenue, firms of color was still significantly less likely to not only get their applications approved, but their loan amounts were not proportional to their revenue and the overall fiscal health of those firms. And so that leaves one to again assess what are these underwriting practices, what is the access opportunities for firms of color, entrepreneurs of color that are trying to secure the capital they need. We also have, and I've referenced a Small Business Credit Survey, but we did a Racism and Economy series, and last summer we did a session on entrepreneurship, and I'm happy to share, for those who are interested, a link to the site with some of the proposals that came. But one of the speakers, one of the panelists we had as part of the session, and it was really prolific to hear her story. She had a 800 credit score, was in business for well over 25 years, had a 20-year banking relationship, was the largest Black-owned business in her state, and was denied a PPP. And her story, unfortunately, wasn't the exception. There were several stories which helped to refine recommendations that came out in other iterations of the deployment of PPP loans. Certainly, she was able to reach the bank leadership and be able to access some resources, but that experience that she shared was not unique. And even when we think about the initial structure of the PPP loans, there were factors that actually impeded entrepreneurs of color from participating, right? One of those criteria that immediately comes to mind, and this is a SBA 7A regulations, but any prior involvement in the criminal legal system prohibits one from participating. And that prior involvement doesn't necessarily mean that that person was convicted. It is at a point of arrest or detainment. And we know, when we think about representation in the criminal legal system, there's a disproportionate representation of Blacks and Browns in that system. And as we consider firms of color and Black entrepreneurship in particular, where 90%, like I said earlier, are not just micro enterprises, they're solopreneurs. Many have leverage entrepreneurship because it is their only way to join the economic mainstream. So as we think about, again, while I'm lifting up PPP as an example, there are standing practices, right? And so as we think about access to those resources, there's an access piece, but there's also like how dollars are actually deployed, and really being intentional to make sure that, again, all businesses have the opportunity to compete and compete in a fair way so that we could fully thrive and Americans can all achieve their full potential, and really we can prosper is incredibly important. I want to pause to just invite my other colleagues who would like to chime in or also have alternative opinions on that question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Janelle. I think you covered the financing piece really well, that even if firms of color are more likely to apply for financing, they are less likely to receive all or some of the financing that they sought from different lenders. And one of the things that I covered in the slides that I presented on were not only the reasons that firms did apply for financing, but also the reasons that firms did not apply. And we saw that there was a stark difference between the percentage of respondents of white-owned firms who were discouraged to apply for financing because they thought they had weak financials or the lender requirements were too strict, compared to 40% of Black-owned firms and 24% of Hispanic-owned firms. So I think your point is really well taken that there's, even if there is that access to credit, we have to kind of dig deeper as well to see what's underlying those assumptions.
Great, thank you so much. As we start to hear that, potentially interest rates may be rising, does that impact this access, or who's the first to feel the impact? Any thoughts on that?
So, we are not prepared to discuss questions around interest rates at this time, but I will say that as we think about particularly recommendations coming out of firms of color and access to resources, we see this as, a real opportunity to think about traditional and non-traditional lending streams. And some of those non-traditional lending streams would not be as subjected to broader market pressures like traditional lending streams.
Great, thanks very much. That's helpful. Also, Dr. Williams, during your presentation, you mentioned leveraging on authentic demand when you were speaking about the shipping containers. And somebody's asking if you could just expand on that a little bit more, just to make it a little more clear what your point was about that.
Absolutely. So we all know the first rule of business is to create a demand, right? Well, it's one of mine. I don't know if it's conventional wisdom, but demand is important. And as we think about broader market pressures, we talk a lot about residential displacement, not so much about business displacement. And so even as we think about helping to stand up these firms, many of them are in-home businesses, and they are exploring the opportunity to have a traditional brick and mortar storefront, or they are interested in expanding from one brick and mortar to a few others. As they think about where should they follow the demand, market pressures also influence where that looks like. And it's very challenging for some of these smaller firms as they either try to enter the space or expand their space to really adopt traditional brick and mortars. So as we think about, certainly there are opportunities for some innovative commercial lease options, but overall as an acquisition strategy, and this is an example, I mean, there isn't science or evidence on it. Right now it's still in its experimentation stage, but shipping containers has been a model where it's relatively, it has a relative modest cost depending on the size of the container, but an entrepreneur is able to access a hot market much easier, as opposed to trying to really think about accessing a really competitive market where, as we know, location is key, location is king. And so one example I'll give is like locally here in Atlanta, we have the Atlanta Beltline, which is really designed to be not only a major infrastructure investment for the city to connect the 26 neighborhood planning units that make up Atlanta, but it also is designed to be an economic development generator. And along the Beltline, they have really created several businesses and jobs. Now, as the Beltline continues to develop, not only are housing prices rising along the Beltline, but commercial options are also becoming increasingly cost prohibitive. And so several groups have been experimenting with shipping containers along the Beltline, which allows smaller firms that candidly would not necessarily have been able to have presence on that type of commercial corridor to actually have presence in that footprint and prepare them to scale larger.
Thanks very much. We do have another question here, and if you haven't asked your question yet, feel free to type it in. Do you think that the inflation that we're seeing, could that impact this recovery? Will it slow it down? Will it speed it up? How might it impact? Are there thoughts on that?
So not to be redundant, but certainly from the Atlanta Fed, we're not prepared to discuss inflation. And it is a magic ball question that several people, I'm sure, would like to know the answer to.
Great, thank you. Let's see what else we have here. For people who are thinking of starting a business, a lot of the community groups that are on now are helping people become empowered financially. If you are starting a business, you're thinking it might be a good way to improve your finances, what do you most recommend? Where do people turn?
Yeah, I can start off with this and then would welcome others to chime in. Actually, one of the greatest sources of small business responses to our credit survey is through state America's SBDCs, Small Business Development Centers. And those are a great resource that everyone has access to. They're often found at colleges across states. And they are a great resource for small business entrepreneurial coaching, for advice on accessing to financing, and much, much more. But that is a really a wealth of knowledge that is at everyone's hands that they should go and check out.
Great, thanks very much. And then, somebody pointed out that sometimes these kind of discussions you take on appear to be politically partisan. What are the programs or initiatives that are backed or supported across the political spectrum? What are the most popular ones across the spectrum? Any thoughts on that from anyone?
I will just offer that every programming, research agenda, engagement approach that we adopt at the Atlanta Fed is really focused on advancing our dual mandate of really monetary policy and maximum employment. And that is where our bias lies to our mandates. That is our responsibility and that is our charge. And so to that end, our work is grounded in research, in evidence, and certainly really leveraging the real-time expertise of stakeholders involved. But that is really where our commitment stands.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that answer. And then Linda, I'll turn it over to you if you had any other questions, or you can wrap up. Thanks very much.
Nelson, and thanks to our guest speakers for hanging in there and answering all of the questions. I'm going to wrap up. Again, we want to thank our sponsor for funding for this webinar. Funding was provided by Chase. Also, if you would like to contribute to consumer action, you can do so online by credit card or PayPal, or you can mail us a check to Consumer Action Attention Membership Giving at 57 Post Street, 6111, San Francisco, California. We would love to hear from you by way of a check, so please feel free to do so. Also, as I stated earlier, the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording no later than tomorrow afternoon. When you receive the link, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is free and it would help us continue bringing you these great webinars. Again, a special thanks to our amazing speakers. Please join me in sending them the love. And also, as Dr. Williams and Ms. Hirt pointed out, participate in these surveys. Share them with your stories. Share the stories that you are hearing from the entrepreneurs that you are working with, because that information helps them create policy. So please share that information. We again, to our speakers, we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with our audience. And to our fantastic audience, thanks again for joining us today. We thank you for the work that we're doing. I look forward to welcoming you back on May 10th for our webinar on privacy. It's going to be a blast. In the interim, please enjoy the rest of your day. If you have any questions about anything, hit me up at linda.williams@consumer-action.org. Bye.